When one is trying to create a piece of dramatic art, it's quite important to get the audience to engage with the characters, to empathise with them, to understand their hopes, their dreams, so that when those disappointments, as those disappointments will, come along, then the audience will go, "Ah," because they understood how much they wanted that thing, and now how bad they're going to feel because they didn't get the thing, and then they'll be overjoyed when they finally get the thing, or whatever. If you want the audience to feel engaged and sympathetic with the characters, you have to tell the audience what these characters want, what's going on in their head, and what they really mean when they say whatever it is that they say. Now, if you're writing a novel, this is dead easy. If you want to tell the reader what's going on in the head of the character, you just tell them, you just write it down. You say, Joan was feeling rather anxious. Normally her children would be back by this time and they were very punctual, but they hadn't called and they were very late and she was starting to get worried. She saw her husband, George, walk into the room. George took one look at his wife and could see that she was in one of her moods. Why was she such a grump, he thought to himself. He'd done everything to make her happy. He'd paid for that huge extension on the house, but that didn't seem to make her one tiny bit happy. But he'd learned that when she was in one of her moods, the wisest thing was just to steer clear of her for a bit, and then she generally cheered up. And he knew that the football was starting soon, so he thought he'd go through to the sitting room and switch on. So he left her to it. So there you go. So now we know who those two characters are, what their names are, what their relationship is, and what's going through their heads, because you've just told them. But in a television program or a movie, the big rule that you'll hear loads of people telling you how to write a script is show, don't tell. So a very bad script writer would have George walk into the room and say, Joan, you look anxious. What is it that is troubling my wife so? You see, he got across her name and that they're married, you see, important facts. And she could then say, well, I'm worried that our children aren't back from school yet. Normally they're very punctual and they always call, and they haven't done that. And look at the time, they are very late. That's why I look so anxious, dear husband of mine. Yeah, terrible, terrible, terrible dialogue. And it's amazing how often you get this expositional dialogue turn up in television programs and films. How should that be put into a script? Well, the show don't tell moment would perhaps start with Joan doing the washing up, and we have close-ups of hands doing dishes, and then her face looking a bit tense and vexed. And she puts something in the dryer, but she's got loads more to do, and she looks up at the clock, and the clock shows some significant time. And then in comes the husband. How do we know that he's the husband? Well, he's wearing slippers, and so he presumably lives there, and she just doesn't even register him. So that presumably means that she's not surprised to see him there. So yeah, husband seems likely. They're about the same age. They look reasonably compatible. He takes one look at her and goes, whoop, and sort of swerves and goes into another room, and we hear click, a television come on and some football noises. So there you go. Not a word being spoken yet, and yet we know that they're husband and wife and what was going through his head, and we know that she's worried about something, but we don't know what yet. Well, we see her walk out into her garden, and she gets to her front gate and leans over and looks up and down the road, and she sees nothing, and she checks her phone. A lesser director would then cut in to a close-up of the phone showing that what she's doing on the phone. She's checking the time or checking for messages or whatever. But actually, we don't need that. So she could just check the phone. And then with some irritation, she realises that she's being looked at. And there's a neighbour mending something in his front garden. He's sneaking a look at her. But she, with irritation, she turns away from him and then goes back inside. Cut to, poof, the last of the dishes goes into the dryer and she pulls the plug in the sink. So we know that time has now passed. Cut to, quite rapidly, she's coming back into the garden. And now she sees a bus. Pulls up at a stop the other side of the road, and she watches with hope and expectation in her eyes. And then some children get off, but she can't quite see them properly because they're the other side of the bus. And so there's a little bit of irritation now, and the bus pulls away. And there is no light of recognition in her eyes. And the children we see, who look annoyingly happy, they walk off in different directions, and her hope turns to disappointment. And now she sees that again she's being looked at by her neighbour, but this time she and her neighbour exchange a longish glance and they look concerned, and she goes back in. So now we know, she's worried about her kids from school, and now she's really worried, getting more worried, because whereas before she was just irritated that she was being watched by the nosy neighbour, now she's grasping for straws. Anyone who can offer her any sympathy and potential aid is welcome, and she now has changed her attitude to her neighbour. So we've got introduced another character, and we've got more going on, and not a single word has been spoken yet. And I put it to you that in the film version, that would be far more moving than anything involving two people just saying, the kids are late and I'm worried. But now, what about the comic book version? Well, comic book if you want to make it sound as though it's for kids, or the graphic novel version if you want to make it sound as though it's for very pretentious adults. I wish there was some term in between the two, something just neutral sounding and reasonably quicker than graphic novel. Too many syllables. How about panel book? Because in a graphic novel, each one of those pictures is called a panel. Panel book, is that good? I don't know. Anyway, I'll start using it now and perhaps it'll catch on. I hope it does. So how would we do that in a panel book? Within a panel book, my goodness, that would make such a boring beginning of a panel book, wouldn't it? You've got page. It takes so many panels to show you what I've just been describing for the film version. And after you're several pages into the thing, you think, well, this is great. I'm halfway through this and it's just a woman doing the washing up. What's going on? It's so boring. How would you, like that bit where she's looking and we see her face with an actress, her face go from hope and expectation to disappointment. Can you see how much my face changed there? It went from to just a very subtle change, but you'll read that on the face of an actress. But if someone faithfully drew those different expressions on her face as she's looking at the bus stop, it would just look like lots of very slightly different pictures of a woman. And you know, how it wouldn't work in a graphic novel. So when you're panel book, I meant to say panel book. When I was writing In Search of Hannibal, my panel book that is being illustrated even now by Chris Steininger, I had this problem come up again and again and again. How do I show not tell, or how do I avoid clunky expositional dialogue? And could I get a scene? What I really wanted is a scene where characters are saying one thing but meaning another. Now, some while ago I made a video about such a scene from Game of Thrones, and I think you should see it. I mean, it's quite short and it's quite funny, or at least it tries to be. And so if you want to fully understand this video, I think it would be good if you watched that. Oh, you've seen it already. Oh, that was quick. Well, the wonders of YouTube. Okay, so you'll have noticed that at the end of that video, I make the point that in a graphic novel, it's very difficult to have these scenes where characters say one thing but mean another. And Chris Steininger saw my video, and though he found it funny in the right places and agreed with the broad sweep of my earlier argument, I think he was a bit piqued, a bit miffed. At the same time near the end, in which he thought that possibly I was having a dig, a poke at his chosen medium. And then he came up with a reply video and made a spirited defence of his chosen medium. But unfortunately, his reply video was on his much smaller channel, and so it didn't get, I feel, the number of views that it deserved. So I'm going to go through his arguments again in this video to what I hope is a wider audience. Now, he said, yes, okay, so we have these two women who meet each other in this scene and they exchange pleasantries, but actually they're being really quite aggressive. To summarise the scene, just in case you haven't bothered to go and see it, one of the characters has just married the son of the other. And the son is now king and is very much in love with his new wife. And so the young wife thinks, oh, brilliant, I'm now married to the power that's ruling the kingdom and I have control over him. So effectively, I'm in charge now. This is brilliant. And this woman who is a potential dangerous rival, I'm going to let her know that she's no longer the power here and that I'm in charge and she's now an irrelevance. And so when she exchanges all these pleasantries, that's what's actually happening. But of course, she never says anything directly unpleasant at all. It's all smiles and niceness. In that scene, he said, right, what I would do is I would first make it clear that these two women are antagonistic by showing them in profile, pointing at each other. You see, you're setting them off against each other. And then what you could do is because they've come together in apparent fellowship, put some barrier between them to let us know subtly that actually these people are not joined in fellowship, that they are apart and opposed. So what you could do is you could put a gutter in between and put them in separate panels like this, each in her own space, defending her own territory. The trouble with that, though, is that the gutter sort of has the meaning in a panel book of then. This, then the gutter, that. This panel, then later, that panel. So it separates them also in time. So he says that better is to put some sort of barrier. It's in the background. It's a pillar, a tree, a post of some sort, some line between them, some barrier, again, which has a sort of the same effect but doesn't separate them in time. And I agree that this works. Although, may I also point out that actually this exact same technique was used by the makers of Game of Thrones. This is a good scene, and the makers of Game of Thrones were a pretty talented lot in many ways. And so yes, that they were alive to the framing and that separation as well. But then you can have one character say something to the other, which sounds quite nice. But then, in the panel book, you push in. You go in a way that you wouldn't in a television program. You go in and show a big close-up of one of the characters' mouth. It's perhaps got this sly smile on it, and then you put another bit of dialogue, the next bit of dialogue in a bubble coming from that mouth. You can't see the eyes, okay? You can't see the windows to the soul. You've just got this mouth. And as Chris put it,
you can almost imagine a forked tongue coming out of there.
Yeah, she's lying. So that's one way. You push into a close-up of the lips, and then that creates a sort of evil, ulterior motive feel. So that was one technique. And another illustration of the same sort of thing is that he has this wide shot when the character is saying, well, what is the proper way to address you now? Queen Mother or Dowager Queen? So he has what is the proper way to address you now as a wide shot, and then comes in close with that big smile. And if you draw it well, you can make it still a fake smile. Queen Mother or Dowager Queen? So, ooh, catty. And then later in the same scene, the outgoing queen, the older woman, she says this.
Good. Good. I'm glad to hear you're happy.
Right. So how do we get across that delivery? Because in that strange baritone of hers, she gets across the idea that she's not really saying that this is good, and she's not really that glad that the other is happy at all. But she's just keeping it together. She's also underneath pretty angry that this upstart is trying to usurp her. So how did Chris suggest it would go about that? Well, he said, well, first you start with this sort of picture, and you'll see that her expression is not very extreme. It's not a big fake smile. It's not anger. It's a fairly sort of neutral, could be pleasant, but could be almost anything sort of expression. And you have her simply saying the word good. And then in the next panel, you have a then with a ... good ... which tells us, because of the panel and the ... that she's stringing this out far more than you would string this out normally, which gives it a certain significance, there is something else to be read into my words sort of feel about it. And notice as well that rather than put the two panels next to each other, he's put one slightly lower. So it lowers you can imagine she says, good. Good. You can imagine the note of her voice might go down, and also the energy of her expression of goodness goes down. Good. Good. The second good doesn't sound as good as the first one. You can see where this is going, so it's going down. And then to really rub it in, we come in for a close-up. And remember what you were saying before, the close-up somehow suggests there is more significance to this than immediately meets the eye when you simply read the words out of the bubble. So we've pushed in slightly. And of course, in the film version, you might track in, you might go closer to the character, suggesting this is an important thing, what's coming next. And then she still says this very bland line, I'm glad to hear that you're happy. And and again, it's the framing is slightly off. There's something uncomfortable about this. Da, 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 good, good, good. So that's how he would suggest you might get across the same sort of idea. You don't have an actor, you don't have an actress to use those subtle inflections, the notes of the voice, the unblinking stare, or the flick of the eye, or the falseness of a smile, or the pause where a pause shouldn't be. All those things that the cast of a television program or a film can bring to bear, they're unavailable. Unfortunately, we don't have actors. So we have to do the acting, and that was him doing the acting, if you like, but in panel book form. There's another part of the same scene where she's fuming, and she storms off with her two guards following her, listening to the tinkling laughter of the sycophants that the younger, the new queen is with, and they're all laughing, and they seem to be accepting that, the one they're being sycophanted to is now in charge, not that old, pathetic old woman who, of course, is enormously more experienced and ruthless and a dangerous woman not to be crossed. Anyway, so how would you get across that laughter and that she's fuming? Well, he suggests, how about showing the picture like this? Go really wide and then show the text of the laughter sort of waving in the air after her, sort of give it a sort of jeering character. It's almost like, I don't know, it's a bit like the manic laughter of the Joker, isn't it? But it's sort of waving in the air after, off you go, ha ha ha. She's being laughed, and her pose as well, and you can make her very dark in the picture. He also made an interesting point that he thinks that the two guards there are actually spoiling the composition of the picture and spoiling the focus of the laughter. He wants it to be clearer that the laughter is aimed at her, or at least that's how she feels that the laughter is being aimed at that point. And so, because it's emotionally better, he would just get rid of the guards entirely. I have to say, I don't myself completely concur with that. I understand why, if there was a fact, there were two guards with her, that is inconvenient for the emotion of the scene, then you may want to minimize the impact of that fact, but simply removing them, it's not necessarily the way I would go, but I see his point. So, sometimes he would make greater sacrifices of truth, if you like, for art than perhaps I would. It's all a matter of judgment. Anyway. And to further illustrate his point, he came up with this notional character. Is it even a human? Could it be an alien? I don't know. It's just this blank face. It's deliberately not meant to be expressing anything with the face at all. But the words say, I'm happy. So do you think this character is happy? Well, it could be happy. How do we know? It's not smiling, but it doesn't look depressed either. It's just this neutral greyish blob with little dots for eyes. Okay, maybe you're happy. But if you wanted to convey it's saying that it's happy, but it's not happy, how about resetting it in a much bigger frame, putting it right near the bottom, putting its face in greater darkness, and then having its words just sort of drift off above in all this vague space above it. I'm happy. And all going well, you read it in the tone intended by the artist. So this is meant to be a creature, a person, or whatever, an entity declaring happiness but not actually feeling it. So there is this emptiness, this space, this darkness in the picture, and the awkwardness of the framing as well. This doesn't look like something said with confidence. If you want to be confident, you stand in the middle, big and bold. I'm happy. But if you're down here, I'm happy, it's not as convincing, is it? It's not as convincing. Anyway, so when I was, as I say, writing, I have finished the script about 4 months ago. I finished the script to In Search of Hannibal. Whew, oh boy, it was a great. I did save to the very end the words "the end," save, send, yes. Oh no, I meant to change. Anyway, yes, I saved to the end the word there. So it was very satisfying to be able to type "the end" in capital letters in the script. Anyway, more about that in a minute. Yes, so when I was going through loads of layouts, he's already drawn most of it and he's laid out an awful lot of the rest. And looking at the layouts, sometimes I see, yeah, he's come up with a really clever way of being the actor for the audience. So, for instance, there's one scene where one character, Fabius, the senior commander, he's the dictator of Rome actually at this point, is having an important logistics meeting in his tent with his quartermasters, and in comes another officer who interrupts, and Fabius, with some irritation, says, "Terribly busy here. I do hope this is urgent." Yes, sorry, sir. I'm afraid Minucius is making speeches again. Yes, he is wont to do that. Yes, but this time it's to the junior officers and in front of their attendants. Do excuse me, gentlemen. And he leaves, you see. So, in that scene, there's a panel with Fabius saying, do excuse me, gentlemen. And what Chris did is he put in one speech bubble there with a little stalk to the mouth of Fabius saying it, and then another little stalk connecting it to a second bubble in which he said, "Do excuse me, gentlemen." So that stalk and the fact that there are two bubbles rather than one suggests that there's time passing between the and the "do excuse me, gentlemen." So he's putting in a pause by his bubble composition. But more, what really impressed me was the size of the bubble in which he wrote simply It just said AH dot in the middle, but they were in the usual size of typeface. So he's not shouting, he's not saying loudly, and yet that is given this enormously, unnecessarily huge speech bubble with this great acreage of space around the word and that gave so much significance to that So we know he's not saying, do excuse me, gentlemen. He's saying, do excuse me, gentlemen. You see, and so so there you go. So to some degree, you can act, but may I also point out that all these ruses, all this having 3 panels for that, cutting in from one to another, and having big speech, everything takes time and takes a vital resource, which is page space. In a panel book, you're trying to tell the story efficiently and quickly, and it's quite difficult to come up with an efficient way. So if you're going to spend several panels on every line of dialogue in order to squeeze all the meaning from it, you're going to have a very slow-paced panel book that's going to not tell much story in the pages available. You're going to be spending an awful lot of time drawing repetitions of the same scene. So there is a problem. So while I concede that it is possible to convey quite a bit of subtlety in a panel book, I will also say that without the resource of actors, it's quite a bit more difficult. And that the graphic novel is not perhaps the best form either for trying to get across. In fact, I would say it's actually a reasonably poor form for getting across this saying one thing but meaning another, and having an internal stream of thought in all the various characters' minds. I try, of course, in the way I tell the story in Search for Hannibal, to make you empathise with a few of the characters. You get to know those, and if you read all the subtle or not so subtle hints in the book, then you should understand what their hopes and fears and disappointments are. And so when they come to whatever end it is that they come to, it presumably has some sort of meaning to you and moves you in some sort of way. Anyway, news on the Hannibal project. So thank you so much to all the backers who backed us all those years ago and have been amazingly patient with us. Now, Chris was contractually obliged to do another graphic novel about Silverwing, the bat. And apparently there's quite a series of these bat-based novels. They're a bit like Watership Down, apparently, but with bats. It's a series that's quite popular. I've never heard of them in Britain, but I think they're quite popular in the USA and other places with the young adult audience. Anyway, so he's been drawing bats for quite a while, and I think actually, from what I gather, he's fairly sick of drawing bats. Anyway, he was contractually obliged to deliver that, and he's just finishing that now. And in about a week or so, he reckons, he's just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. You know what it's like with publishers. They always want, a couple of little changes made. And I suppose some of them are for his own satisfaction. I could have drawn that particular bat in that particular panel just a little bit better. There you go, done. So he's just finishing it off, and then he will go back full-time to Hannibal. And that's wonderful for all the backers of the thing, because you're going to get your novel. It looks as though the novel's going to be maybe a little bit longer than we had originally planned, but then you get more novel. So that's all right, isn't it? Unfortunately, printing and distribution costs have over the last few years changed somewhat, but that's the problem we're going to have to cope with somehow. Anyway, so yes, I've finished the script. Chris is getting back to the project and drawing it, and in order to do so, he had to turn down a contract for later novels in the Bat series. That is an expression, I suppose, of his faith in the script, which is rather gratifying. Anyway, so good news on the Hannibal front, and yes, so there you go. I wanted to present those arguments that Chris came up with for just how you can, in fact, get across the subtleties of acting in the form of a panel book.